The world you think you know is not the world you're living in. Every rule, every expectation, every normal behavior has been crafted to keep you in line, to shape you into someone you never agreed to become. But the truth is darker than you could ever imagine. What you've been taught to accept as reality is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. And the moment you begin to see it, your entire life starts to unravel. There's a wound you've carried your entire life. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't scar, and yet it governs everything. Your relationships, your ambitions, your fears. This wound is shame. Not the kind that passes when you make a mistake and apologize. This is deeper. John Bradshaw called it toxic shame, a sense not that you've done something wrong, but that you are something wrong. It begins in childhood, often invisibly. A look of disgust, a dismissive tone, a parent too wounded to see you, a culture that rewards silence over truth. Slowly you learn. Your needs are too much. Your feelings are inconvenient. Your real self is unacceptable. And so you adapt. You begin to hide. You become good, obedient, successful. But underneath it all, a voice whispers, "If they saw who I really am, they'd leave." This is how the false self is born, not from deception, but from a desperate longing to be loved. Bradshaw believed toxic shame is passed down like a family curse. Generations raised by wounded people who never learned to feel, to express, to forgive themselves. And this shame isn't just personal, it's systemic. It's embedded in religion, education, politics. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it in the moral systems that taught you to feel guilty for your instincts, weak for your desires, sinful for your aliveness. God is dead, he declared, not because he hated the divine, but because the God he saw preached submission, guilt, and control. Nietzsche called for the Übermensch, the one who dares to create values from within, who lives beyond the reach of shame. But how can you live beyond shame when you don't even know it's there? That's the trap. Shame doesn't scream, it whispers. It shows up in your perfectionism, your procrastination, your addiction to praise, your fear of being alone. It shows up every time you betray your truth just to be accepted. You don't know who you are because you've spent your life trying to be what others approve of. And the first step in remembering who you are is facing the pain you've been running from. The pain of being unseen. The pain of becoming invisible to survive. The wound is real, but so is the self that lies beneath it. Toxic shame is not a feeling, it's an identity. Unlike guilt, which says, "I did something bad," shame says, "I am bad." John Bradshaw warned us that toxic shame is the root of the false self, a psychic cancer that festers quietly in the soul, shaping every thought, every relationship, every ambition. It is born in the moment a child internalizes rejection, ridicule, or neglect, and begins to believe that their authentic self is unworthy of love. So they begin to split. A part of them, the wild, creative, spontaneous core, is exiled, buried beneath layers of adaptation. In its place, a counterfeit self is constructed, a mask that smiles when it's supposed to, pleases when it's expected, obeys when it longs to scream. This false self isn't a choice, it's a survival mechanism. But over time, survival becomes a prison. And the saddest part is we forget we're wearing the mask. Nietzsche called this the morality of the herd, a system that rewards conformity and punishes instinct. He believed most people never live. They merely obey. They become what is acceptable rather than what is true. The false self becomes a virtue in a world terrified of authenticity. And so, under the weight of invisible rules and silent expectations, we disappear from ourselves. We lose our ability to act from the inner yes of the self and begin to live from the outer should of society. We become good boys, nice girls, high achievers, loyal citizens. But we are hollow. We are dying behind the smile. Bradshaw called this the shame-bound life, and Nietzsche saw it as spiritual death. For both thinkers, the way out begins not with rebellion for its own sake, but with the brutal honesty of inner confrontation. You must dare to ask, who am I beneath the persona? Who would I be if I were no longer afraid of rejection? of failure, of disapproval? The false self is terrified of these questions because it cannot survive the truth, but the authentic self is waiting, not to be created but remembered. And every act of inner honesty tears a piece from the mask. Every act of courage makes the soul visible again. There's a difference between morality and conscience, but you were never taught that. From a young age, you were conditioned to believe that obedience was virtue, that guilt was goodness, and that the suppression of desire was the highest form of character. What you didn't know was that this moral code wasn't made to protect your soul. It was designed to control it. John Bradshaw understood this clearly. Toxic shame becomes internalized as your conscience, making you mistake emotional self-repression for moral strength. Nietzsche took it further. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he revealed how the concept of good was corrupted by the powerless to shame the powerful. The noble, once proud of their instincts, strength, passion, confidence, were made to feel guilty for them. Good no longer meant powerful, but tame. Evil no longer meant cruel, but alive. Thus, guilt was weaponized against the self. You grew up believing that to be humble was to shrink, that to be kind was to be passive, that to be loved was to earn it through suffering. And worst of all, you called this your conscience. But real conscience is not shame-based. Real conscience arises from awareness, empathy, and truth. It speaks not in the voice of fear, but in the voice of responsibility. What you call your conscience may just be the internalized voice of your parents, your church, your teachers, your culture. It's not your voice, it's theirs, echoing inside you. And when you violate it, when you say no instead of yes, when you speak your truth instead of staying silent, you feel guilty, not because you've done wrong, but because you've broken the rules of the false self. This is how shame replaces the soul. It binds you to a moral system built on repression. You follow rules you didn't choose, fear punishments that no longer exist, and confuse fear for ethics. But Nietzsche offered a different vision, the sovereign individual, one who has overcome the slave morality, who creates values from the depths of their own soul. That's what Bradshaw meant by reclaiming the inner child, not returning to immaturity, but to innocence. To reclaim a conscience uncorrupted by fear. To begin again, not with rules, but with truth. And that truth is this: you were never born to obey. You were born to become. You didn't create the false self because you were weak. You created it because you were alone. From the moment your authentic needs were denied, your anger punished, your sadness ignored, your joy dismissed, you had to choose between being real and being safe. You chose safety. You became what they needed you to be. The quiet one, the pleaser, the achiever, the tough one. And with every mask you put on, you buried something deeper beneath. John Bradshaw called this the loss of the inner child. But it was more than just the loss of innocence. It was the murder of spontaneity, the self you had to kill to survive. And here's the truth no one tells you. Your false self worked. It protected you. It helped you avoid rejection, abandonment, humiliation. It made you acceptable. But what saved you then is what is killing you now. Because the false self doesn't know how to love. It only knows how to perform. It doesn't know intimacy. It only knows approval. It doesn't know joy. It only knows success. And slowly, painfully, it starts to collapse. That collapse is what most people call anxiety, depression, burnout, emptiness. But beneath it is a deeper fracture, the self that split in half. Nietzsche warned of this when he spoke of the last man, the individual who, in escaping danger, also escapes greatness, who avoids suffering but also avoids becoming. The false self is a tomb built out of politeness, social roles, and silent agreements. You smile while dying inside. You nod while your soul screams no. And worst of all, you don't even know you're lying. That's the danger of a mask worn too long. It fuses to the skin. It becomes your face. But healing begins with one terrifying act: to admit that the life you've built isn't truly yours. that the roles you play are not your essence, and that behind every perfectionist, every workaholic, every nice guy or good girl is a child who once needed to be loved without conditions. To heal the false self is to mourn it, to thank it for its service, and then let it die, so something real can be born. Not the child you were, not the adult you pretended to be, but the soul you were always meant to become. The false self was your mask, but the shadow is your exile. It is everything you had to repress, deny, and destroy in yourself just to survive the gaze of your parents, your teachers, your culture. If the false self is the costume you wore to stay safe, the shadow is the graveyard of the parts you buried to make yourself lovable. John Bradshaw called it the disowned self, the pieces of your humanity too raw, too wild, too honest for a wounded world to accept. Your rage, your sexuality, your envy, your neediness, your dreams, your power, your despair, and perhaps most tragically, your joy. Because even your joy, when it threatened someone else's control, had to go. So you cut yourself in half. You became good, which meant you stopped being whole. You became moral, which meant you became afraid. And yet, as Nietzsche warned, morality born of fear is not virtue. It is self-censorship dressed as sainthood. He saw this clearly in the slave morality of the herd, where strength is called arrogance, where passion is condemned as sin, and where obedience is confused with goodness. But what society calls bad, your soul calls real. And that's the paradox of the shadow. It holds both your darkness and your gold. What you reject in yourself doesn't disappear. It festers. It leaks through sarcasm, passive aggression, addictions, anxiety, control. It sabotages your relationships. It stalks you in dreams, fantasies, triggers. But the moment you turn toward it with honesty, not judgment, you begin to reclaim something sacred. Because hidden in your anger is your boundaries. Hidden in your envy is your longing. Hidden in your grief is your love. And hidden in your shame is your lost self-worth. Shadow work isn't about indulging your worst impulses. It's about retrieving the parts of your soul that had to go underground. It's an act of psychological resurrection. And it demands immense courage, because you'll have to admit you were never the person you pretended to be. You'll have to grieve the pain of hiding your truth. But once the shadow is integrated, a new force emerges: authenticity. And that, as Nietzsche wrote, is the beginning of becoming who you are. Not as the world wanted you to be, but as life itself demanded you to become. Toxic shame doesn't just hurt you, it freezes you. It arrests your psychological development and traps your soul in a moment that never ended. You may grow in age, but inside, the wounded child remains, unchanged, unheard, unseen. John Bradshaw called this the frozen child, the part of you that internalized the belief: something is wrong with me, not something you did, but something you are. This belief doesn't fade over time. It calcifies. It solidifies into your identity. It shapes the roles you take, the relationships you tolerate, the careers you choose, the dreams you abandon, and it plays on loop. You become stuck in repetition, not because you're weak, but because shame rewrites your internal code. It distorts your perception of reality. When someone loves you, you wonder what they want. When you succeed, you fear being found out. When you feel joy, you wait for punishment. The present is haunted by the past. This is why Nietzsche called memory a form of torture. Because you're not remembering facts, you're reliving a judgment. And every new experience becomes infected by that original wound. You can't trust life, because life once hurt you and no one came to save you. So you carry the past like a shield. You call it being realistic, but really it's hypervigilance. You're not living, you're defending. And the saddest part, you think it's you, but it's not. It's your trauma. It's the voice of a parent, a teacher, a religion that shamed your aliveness and made you believe you had to earn love by being less. Nietzsche saw this as one of the most tragic consequences of repression: the soul's gradual decay. He warned that when we kill off our instincts in the name of obedience, we also kill off our vitality. And without vitality, there is no becoming, only surviving. To break the cycle, you don't need more willpower. You need truth. You need to look the past in the eye and say, "You no longer get to define me." You need to rescue the part of you that got left behind. This is not regression, it's redemption. Healing is not forgetting what happened. It's remembering who you were before you learned to be ashamed. That's where freedom begins, not in escape, but in retrieval. Liberation does not come from external forces. It doesn't come from waiting for others to validate you, to see the truth of your worth, or to rescue you from your shame. Liberation comes when you stop fighting the truth of who you are, when you confront your darkest parts, your vulnerabilities, and your hidden desires, and accept them. Nietzsche famously said, "Become who you are." A simple phrase, but it's a radical call to arms. It's a call to shed the layers of falsehoods, projections, and defenses you've built over years. It's a call to reclaim your power from the beliefs that have held you captive. The first step in this process is not external change. It's not changing your circumstances or hoping for a miracle. It's an internal revolution, a shift in how you view yourself. When toxic shame has its grip on you, it's easy to believe that you are fundamentally flawed, that you must be broken and fixable only through approval, success, or perfection. But that is a lie. The truth is that you are already whole. You have always been whole. Your shame doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. The journey to becoming who you are is the journey of reconciling with your humanity, the fullness of your being. This means acknowledging your flaws without self-loathing, embracing your desires without guilt, and owning your story without regret. It means standing tall in the knowledge that you are worthy of love, of freedom, and of self-expression, not because you've earned it, but because it's your birthright. Nietzsche understood that we all carry burdens, society's expectations, familial conditioning, the weight of our past. But he also believed in our ability to transcend these burdens through the power of will. To will yourself into your true self is an act of defiance against the forces that seek to keep you small, quiet, and obedient. But this process of becoming isn't easy. It requires you to confront your deepest fears, your fear of rejection, of not being enough, of standing alone. But it is only by facing these fears head-on, by choosing authenticity over approval, that you can break free from the cycle of shame. You cannot become who you are if you keep hiding parts of yourself. Liberation lies in self-confrontation. This is where true strength is born, not from suppressing your humanity, but from embracing it fully. When you can stand in the truth of who you are, despite everything the world has told you to be, you've unlocked the door to your freedom. The false self is like a mask, meticulously crafted from the expectations, criticisms, and judgments of others. It is a persona you wear to gain approval, to fit in, to avoid rejection. Over time, this mask becomes so ingrained that you begin to mistake it for your true identity. But behind the mask, the real you, the authentic, untainted self, remains hidden, suffocating in the shadows of conformity. Nietzsche's philosophy offers us a revolutionary path to freedom, the dismantling of this false self. He knew that the individual could not experience true greatness unless they faced the terrifying task of deconstructing all that was false, all that had been imposed upon them by society, family, and culture. The false self is not simply a social construct, it is an emotional prison. It locks you in a perpetual cycle of striving for an idealized version of yourself, one that is acceptable to others but disconnected from your genuine desires and emotions. You may have learned to perform roles of being the perfect child, the hardworking employee, the dutiful friend, roles that earned you validation but left you hollow inside. Breaking free from the false self requires a profound act of self-awareness. It begins with the painful realization that much of who you think you are is a collection of roles you've played, not the essence of your being. You must peel back the layers of learned behaviors, unconscious patterns, and self-imposed limitations. This process is not easy. It involves facing the painful truth that much of your life has been spent living for others, conforming to their standards, and repressing your own desires. But this is the path to self-liberation. By recognizing the ways you have shaped your identity to please others, you can begin to strip away the false layers. You can challenge the limiting beliefs that have kept you small, the fears that have bound you to mediocrity, and the guilt that has kept you in a state of emotional paralysis. Rebuilding from within means allowing yourself to feel without shame. It means releasing the need for constant validation and instead, nurturing your inner voice.